Hi, my name is Phoebe Maltz Bovy. I'm the author of the book, The Perils of Privilege, and I teach French at the University of Toronto. And I'm very excited to be speaking today with Katie Herzog. Would you like to introduce yourself, Katie?
Yeah, I'm a staff writer at The Stranger, affectionately known as Seattle's only newspaper. We're an alt biweekly, much loathed over the past 30 years. The paper, not me. Maybe both, actually.
Oh, great. So I really wanted to talk to you both because lots of things you say on Twitter and in articles have interested me, but also more specifically because of one article that you wrote about people as trash.
Trash people, yeah.
Trash people. And I would like you to talk a little bit about that. And I would also like to talk about it because it's fascinating.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess to explain the piece, what was happening when I wrote it? I can't remember exactly what was happening when I wrote it. It could have been anything. I could have just looked at Twitter that day and seen the word trash come up. This is sort of I know that trash is just sort of, it's a cliched term for something you don't like. But that particular term and what it represents has started to really bother me because I think people use it to shut down conversations. And so I'm a critic. I have no problem with criticism. I think criticism is good. I think we should all be critics and we should all be doing more critical thinking. But I think, especially because of social media and probably most specifically on Facebook and Twitter, criticism it's not criticism anymore. It's just sort of, you just dismiss people whose ideas that you don't like as trash. And I keep seeing that over and over again. Specifically, I think after the Katie Roiphe piece in Harper's, not after it came out. Certainly right. She was called trash after it came out. But before the piece came out, when there were these rumors circulating that she was going to disclose the creator of the shitty media men list, this sort of viral, I guess, I don't know if it was viral, but this list of allegations against men who work in media. Some of them were really serious, some of them were sort of vague, like creepy dude, this like list populated by names that none of them were fact checked. These were just like, it was a whisper network, an online whisper network. BuzzFeed wrote about it, it got a ton of attention, and then when Katie Roiphe was, according to rumors, was going to publish the name of the person who disclosed the list, there was this huge outcry on media Twitter. And considering that she, for the last 20, 30 years, has written some things that are sort of generally maybe unpopular, especially in feminist circles. She's written things questioning the narrative of the campus rape epidemic. People didn't trust that she would handle this well, but this was based sort of on these unfounded rumors, and everybody was just like, there was no sort of analysis of what was happening. It was just trash, you're garbage, you're trash. And I just like, I'm sick of it. It just pissed me off. And I'm not a Roiphe apologist by any means. I just think that criticism should be criticism. I don't think that people's work should necessarily be a reflection of who they are as people. So what to me has happened is like, and I said this in the piece, right now, if you disagree with someone, you're wrong, and if you're wrong, you're bad, and if you're bad, you're trash. And I just think that's a hugely destructive narrative, and one that it keeps us in these echo chambers where we're not learning from each other and we're not challenged by ideas that we might disagree with, because people are terrified of being labeled trash. It's a harmful term, and it's also a very uncreative one that's just like a cliche, and that's annoying about it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what struck me so much about the Roiphe story and the sort of specifically like this whole trash angle is that it seems to extend not just to the writer who writes whichever piece is or is anticipated to be, or both, controversial, but it became what I found so fascinating that happened when the piece actually appeared was that everybody was talking about it, but no one would link to it. Like, as if you somehow become, I mean, I did not agree with a lot of the piece. Mm-hmm. I didn't think it made sense. If I was reading it, if other people were reading it, if this is not some sort of Nazi, propaganda material, this is, a contrarian feminist-ish essay, link to it if you're reading it, I know. And it just, I think that what seems to have happened online is that there's this kind of this sense that you can become tainted even if you
Right.
don't actually take the controversial stance. And I think that what trash really gets at so well, that to bring that aspect of it up, is this sense of that it's not just one person who's wrong and being harshly called out, but it's this notion of sort of contagion, that like if you don't position yourself as on like pure, sort of this purity thing. And I think that's what frustrates me so much, because I think somebody like Katie Royfey probably is anticipating hostility to what she's written, and may stand to gain from it and so forth. But I think I just find it's very conceptually difficult to figure out how you even talk about that sort of silencing, not the silencing of somebody who, is going to talk regardless, but the silencing of somebody who might agree a little bit or just want to talk about it. Yeah.
Right. Or people who don't have a platform. After I wrote that piece, I got contacted by a lot of people who are readers, not writers. And they told me their stories, and some of them I ended up meeting with in person in Seattle, which was very cathartic for us to be able to get together and talk and bitch about life, or bitch about the internet mostly. And a lot of the people I spoke to are terrified of stating their opinion in public now. And this is happening within the left. So it's not just, this isn't people who support Donald Trump and don't want their family to know about that secretly, which is genuinely a shameful thing, I believe. Although I don't think that, although I don't necessarily think that all Trump supporters are trash, but I do think that there is that's a
trash. It's a trash choice. That's hard to say. Trash choice to make, perhaps.
Right. Yeah. So all of these people so they disagree about sort of the details of things that are happening. People who might have thought that the Aziz Ansari thing, thought that maybe disagreed with the babe.net piece about him, but just felt so terrified to say this in public. And at the same time, one of the things that I cover for The Stranger is sort of these local online mobs, which is a great thing to cover because there is never any shortage of them. And so, like, something happened here a few months ago. There was this thing called the Punk Rock Flea Market, which is it happens twice a year. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a bunch of old punks who get together and have this flea market. And they do it in spaces that are typically going to be torn down. So like grocery stores that are going to be torn down for redevelopment, stuff like that. So at the most recent one, a vendor was there with a T-shirt that was determined by a patron of the flea market to be offensive. So the T-shirt had a picture of the Pillsbury Doughboy, and the Pillsbury Doughboy was doing like a Heil Hitler, and it said "White Flower." And so this T-shirt it's not all right.
Okay.
So this is not new imagery, and sort of this is actually an anti-fascist T-shirt. This image has been around for 20 years, even in protests in Olympia, Washington. 12 years ago, people had this image on posters. But in the meantime, a lot of things have happened. For one thing, Trump is president. The internet has become more of a thing. Twitter happens. And so a vendor had this T-shirt, which she considered an anti-racist T-shirt. A patron at the flea market was incredibly offended by this, reacted in a sort of a histrionic way. I would classify it as histrionic, to seeing this T-shirt, tore apart the booth, like really pitched a fit. And the rumor and was kicked out of the flea market. The people who run the flea market asked the woman to take her T-shirt away, sort of explain the situation to her or whatever. She put the T-shirt away. So soon after that, like, the rumors start swirling on social media, and the narrative that is pushed there is that the guy who runs the flea market, who is a Jewish man, married to a woman who's Spanish, whose family lived under the Franco regime. And the narrative that was pushed on social media, the story became he kicked a woman of color out of this flea market, which wasn't true. The person who pitched a fit was not a person of color. And then the story became he became a Nazi in the eyes of social justice Seattle Twitter. Wow. This guy who's an anti-racist activist, he became a Nazi. He's a Jew who became a Nazi. And this story just spread and spread and spread. And he's he's a guy who works in affordable housing. Like, he's not a Nazi, but that didn't matter. And no matter how much he defended himself, he defended himself in ways that people objected to, and that became the story too. The way he defended himself against these allegations of being a Nazi, these unfounded allegations, and that shit just happens over and over and over. It happens all of the time, especially in places, I think, like Seattle, for instance. And people there's no critical thinking. Nobody bothers to question the narrative. And so to me, that also, with the Royfi thing, like, that's also what bothered me about it, was that you had reporters who were going to Twitter, instead of reporting it out, instead of actually, like, getting Harper's on the record, talking to Royfi, writing, like, reporting out the story, they just took to Twitter and pushed out these, what were rumors. And to me, it's just like, that's incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly damaging to people's reputations. And it's just not good for society. If Twitter mobs can get Harper's to shut down stories, which they didn't, I think, to their credit, regardless of the problems with the stories. I was impressed by Harper's unwillingness to give in to the mob in that case.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So the sort of online pylons, like what you're talking about, I wrote about these for my book, but a lot of what I had researched was stuff from sort of not necessarily pre-Twitter, but sort of before Twitter really took off, and it was like in blog comments. So it had that same sort of a lot of what I wrote about it, that same sort of general structure of somebody trying to be kind of, either anti-racist, or trying to often, specifically the cases I was talking about are somebody admitting their privilege, and that is nothing gets people telling you you're privileged faster than saying, I acknowledge my privilege, and everyone's
right.
That's going to be a sore point. Let me, So, but what seems to have changed, well, there's the Trump aspect and the sort of Nazi angle, which can't say I was anticipating, despite being a somewhat paranoid Jewish person. I didn't know that was coming. But also, just the sort of scale of all of this, because what I was writing about, especially, were like these things in Jezebel comments and other blog comments where there's a lot of hostility, and it's within some sort of feeling of an online community, but there isn't that sort of scale where it just feels like everybody is involved, and also everything ramps up where every one of these things is not just the misinformation, but it's also like, it's just assumed that there's going to be threats. You know what I mean? Like, it's assumed that everything's going to ramp up to that level. And then what I find frustrating is sometimes the person at the start of one of these controversies will say something that I don't agree with, but I don't want to pile on because I see that it's just like going to become that. And then inevitably they'll respond saying, I got death threats, and it's like, they did, and that's wrong. And then it's like, you can't really have conversations anymore because that's where it all goes. So.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's this threat of doxing, which not to minimize the very real threat of public information getting out there, but I would really, and I don't know the answer to this, I would really like to know about what happens when people do get doxed. I mean, I know about stories where, like, gamers will like SWAT each other, where they call a SWAT team. Have you heard about this?
No, I don't know much about the gamer stuff.
Yeah, I don't either. That's one subculture that I think is too toxic for me to even care about. But so apparently gamers do this thing where they'll call in they'll call into a police department and say that there's a hostage situation or something like that at this person's house, and then the SWAT team comes with their guns drawn, and people have actually died because of this. I don't know if this happens in Canada, but it's crazy.
I'm American, so I have not heard of this. I have not heard of this.
Yeah,
but I mean that's something. Wow.
Yeah, that's a terrible, fucked up thing to do.
I mean, I've been kind of doxed myself, as it were, which is sort of an absurd thing to say because I'm not anonymous. But I wrote an article for the New Republic. This was in 2015, saying that guns should be banned, which I continue to believe. And I got that. So I'd read about how it is for women online, for Jews online, and so forth. The only time I really, really dealt with like that version of online was when I wrote that article. And then for like 2 weeks straight, I couldn't go on Twitter. I couldn't do anything. It was just constant everything, with the threats of all kinds. But the creepiest part, and the only one that really was like a real specific problem, was that there was somebody who was getting in touch with my work, basically, he or she, but I'm going to just hazard a guess.
Yeah.
It's you never know.
I can probably safely assume it was a he.
It's just a hunch that this gentleman emailed, like my boss, everybody at work, and I mean, like, they had to get security involved. It was really, it was a big deal, and so I just think there should be some sort of like bar where like harsh criticism is fine, like threats or something else. Like, I just wish that could be not controversial, which apparently it is. I don't know.
And there's also this, what I get all the time is people demanding that I get fired, which to me is just like, what? Because you disagree with my opinion about something, you want me to get fired? I mean, that's crazy. And we live in these insane echo chambers where, like, if you disagree with someone, that is violence, that is threatening. But that's the problem. Like, I mean, I think in the U.S. especially, because we saw after the Trump election that the silos that we knew about were way more siloed than we thought. Trump won, the left was shocked about this. And I think a huge part of that is because the left doesn't consume right-wing media and the right doesn't consume left-wing media. And so we live in different worlds. And if we're going to shut down dissent within our own, within our own party, if party is even the right word, but within our own side, then we're siloing ourselves off even more. To me, it's just like, this is the problem. We need more debate, not less of it.
Well, I think in terms of the Trump thing, and I was really glad you brought that up in the piece, the trash piece, because, this is something I've thought about a lot as well, even though I wrote my book I just finished it. I was like writing the afterword right after Trump was nominated. And it just seemed like maybe like a couple things were going on. Like, basically, the left, I think, just got way too focused on sort of these minor issues amongst sort of the infighting and so forth. And didn't quite realize that there's actual racism and sexism and so forth, as versus just like misinterpreted, well-meaning remarks. You know what I mean? Like that there's something worse out there. And I feel like that's where things kind of went wrong. But I also think and this is maybe if we're going to debate such as it is on Blogging Heads, that I think there's also the danger in overstating the sort of witch hunt case and so forth. And I think there needs to be some sort of like, I don't know how to sort of find that balance there, where basically I think a lot of the time the things that are referred to as nobody can say it, it's like people can say them, but only if they're professional contrarians, and it just gets confusing because the people you hear about this from are the people like Katie Roiphe and so forth, or my former employer Andrew Sullivan, for example, who that's their career, so they're not being silenced, but they represent that phenomenon of the silenced, which makes it confusing because it's like, well, they're doing fine.
Yeah. I think silencing may frequently be the wrong word, especially when we're talking about sort of pundits, like the Bari Weiss thing, when Bari Weiss tweeted to explain to the viewers, if you were lucky enough to miss this episode. So Bari Weiss is an opinion writer.
I mean, I didn't miss it, but you should explain it. Yeah.
So Bari Weiss is an opinion and a columnist at the New York Times, and she tweeted. What did the tweet say? It said she was referencing Hamilton during the Olympics. And do you recall the actual
It was something about immigrants get it done, I think.
Immigrants, they get the job done.
Something like that.
Which was a reference to a line in Hamilton, which I've never seen. But apparently, if you've seen Hamilton, it's a very obvious reference.
I have not seen Hamilton, but I could pretend like, oh that was very, very important in Hamilton. Yes.
So then the pile-on started, and I think that is a good example of what you're talking about. Like, that pile-on was crazy big, and it has continued, like, because there's the pylon, and then there's the think pieces about the pylon, and then there's the think pieces about the backlash to the backlash, and the whole cycle just continues with more people saying, like, why are you writing it? Like, criticize, like, the Atlantic writes pieces defending her, people write pieces criticizing the Atlantic defending her. It's just sort of, it's a content issue. But what she said, and she arguably used othering language and was sort of tone deaf in this tweet, but what she was saying was a complimentary thing about this person and about immigrants, you know, an oppressed group in the United States right now. And so this tiny little thing blows up into this huge story. All of the media is paying attention to it when there's much, much bigger shit going on. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone.
So what I thought with that, so I thought her initial tweet did come across as offensive. I wasn't losing sleep over it. I think there's way worse out there. I don't think it was intended to be something evil, you know? I thought it's a not good tweet, but it doesn't make her a piece of trash. It makes her a human being who tweeted something. I think what I was torn about is, so she didn't, the whole thing was that she didn't apologize.
Right.
And at first I thought, I was torn because I thought, yeah, you know, I think she'd said something that wasn't great. But I also know how it goes online. And I know that if you apologize, it only somehow makes things worse. So I kind of couldn't blame her for not apologizing, because it just seems like, but then again, this brings up that other question of, she's somebody who stands to gain from causing controversy in a way that others don't. And I think it's really important to remember that people who stand to gain from causing controversy, and I wrote a book called The Perils of Privilege. I have to include myself in some way or another. I mean, among them, you know, it can still hurt. It can still hurt to have 1 million people angry at you online. Yeah. It can still feel like 1 million people when it's 10 people and so forth. Yeah. So I think it's tricky. I also think that what gets super confusing, and I guess, I don't know if this is straying too much from the Bari Weiss specifically, because she's at the Times, but I think often it gets assumed online that anybody who's any sort of journalist is like making $500,000 a year and you know, somehow untouchable and has the platform and is on their perch. It's always like their perch, and it's like, I don't know, like I don't really have such a perch despite having written a book, and you know, like so I don't know. I think these tricky things.
I think that's very real. It's just there's this assumption because you have a platform that you're somehow making a lot of money, or that you have, I don't know, that like the platform itself comes with other perks, which is definitely not true from my experience. If anything, having a platform in Seattle has made me well more hate. Like it comes with fewer perks than it does. There are more downsides than there are perks, at least is what it feels like, being someone who's sort of a contrarian in Seattle. It definitely doesn't feel like, I know it is a privilege to sort of have these positions, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it, especially when what you're trying to do is articulate your opinion about something. Which is, my opinion might be different from somebody's, but that doesn't mean that I'm a bad person.
Right. I mean, I think that's what seems to be the missing piece here. And that's what I liked so much about your piece about trash, because Arya from Blogging Heads and I we were having this back and forth about, because this question of people being sort of good and bad. And I think that trash really, it's just this notion of people as somehow like irredeemable, this notion that, I mean, I think that I was recently blocked on Twitter for being not hostile to somebody else on Twitter. You know what I mean? Like, you never know. But like, I think there's no other explanation for this. And I think it's just like this notion that you represent not only your own ideas, but the ideas of everybody you haven't denounced. Right. That's the part that's just, and if you don't, if you don't police I got my first sort of experience being on the wrong side of the public eye was so before I started working at The Stranger, I wrote about climate change, and I got tons of hate mail about that, but it all came from the right, and so I didn't give a shit. I like do not care if someone who doesn't believe in climate change, or worse, thinks it's a Chinese hoax, thinks that my work is shit. I don't care. But then when I started writing for The Stranger, and I was writing about things happening in my own community, I wrote a big piece on detransitioning, which is, you know, when somebody
transitions from one gender to the other and then transitions back to their sex at birth. And the backlash was enormous for that piece. And it wasn't an opinion piece. This was reported. It was, I maintain a balanced and neutral piece. But the backlash to that was just enormous. And it really sort of opened my eyes to this hostility that I hadn't known that it existed before. And I think that, unfortunately, I think frequently it takes being the subject of that sort of hostility, and people tried to shut me down. They tried to demand an apology. Like Bari, I refused to apologize because I didn't think that I'd done anything wrong. I did write a very long rebuttal to some of the criticism in that piece, but I refused to apologize, which made things worse.
Well, I think if you would have apologized, it might have also, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I mean, I think it's quite different. I know which piece you're talking about, and I think that's very different from making an inadvertently racist joke or comment on Twitter. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
Right. Well, it's sort of that experience for me being the first time after being the target of the right and not giving a shit about it, but feeling this ire coming from my own community. And I'm a queer person. And so it wasn't just like Jesse Singal, who writes about this stuff a lot for New York Magazine and for other places. Jesse has gotten more shit for writing about trans issues than probably most people. But Jesse's also not queer. And so for me, it was very much like, you know, the knocking is coming from inside the house. It was very much like, it was super personal. It still remains very personal. There are lots of places in Seattle that I don't go to anymore because there are flyers up in the city calling me transphobic. Like people were burning. Yeah, people were burning.
This is interesting. I mean, it's awful. But I hadn't realized how much things from online can kind of make their way offline in that way, because I guess I'm just also less sort of plugged into the place where I live in that way, because like my sort of media, such as it is, relationships are more in the States, but I live in Toronto. I hadn't realized that could.
Oh yeah, it had really serious repercussions for my social life, and I'm someone I've been a homosexual and out homosexual for 15 years, and I was completely kicked out of my own community by a lot of people. Some people stood by me, but the number of people who stood by me was much smaller than the number of people who told me to go fuck myself. And I'm talking about people that I was friends with. So that's the other thing is like. I know that to people who aren't involved in these battles, it can seem like something that just goes away.
What you were saying about life in Seattle after writing that article, it's upsetting. I mean, to hear that,
it still sucks. It's very like, and that was sort of compounded by the fact that there's some very prominent voices in Seattle, people with, 100,000 followers on Facebook who hated the piece, and they used their platform to call me out personally. And so instead of, and of course, because people they didn't link to the piece, just like said, there's this piece of shit in The Stranger, burn it or whatever, don't read it. And then instead of actually reading the piece and seeing that it was just a report about things that are actually happening in the world, and it wasn't editorialized, and there was like my own personal views on gender, I don't think anybody would be able to discern from that particular piece. And which is also something that I have learned by now not to talk about publicly. There's some things I will touch and some things I won't touch for that reason. And so people just assumed that it was true because this pillar of the community said that Katie Herzog is a TERF, and so therefore I became a TERF, despite what I actually believe. It was terrible. But also, but the truth is I also did benefit from it in some ways, which, I got a job. I mean, not directly because of that, but it certainly elevated my platform locally, just to elevated it and lowered it at the same time.
I'm familiar with this sort of dynamic. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what do you think can be done for the people who want to speak out about things, but do not in any way stand to gain from doing so? Like, and how can that be covered, I guess, also? Because that could be, like, I feel like I read so many articles that have this line in them, all my friends are quietly telling me such and such, and I have had the conversations with these, you know what I mean? I know, but I don't know how that can be covered when it's by definition people who don't want to talk on the record about it. Their opinions.
I mean, that's a huge problem. I don't know that you can't force people to come out, about being a contrarian or just disagreeing about stuff. But I do think that, did you see that sort of crazy thread on Twitter yesterday? And I'm forgetting the guy who wrote it, but it was this guy, maybe his name's Omar, I think he's Canadian. And he wrote this thread on Twitter that was about what he's calling alt-libs.
No, I followed a variety of, I'm procrastinating a couple deadlines and followed a variety of Canadian threads yesterday, but not that one. No.
Okay, so I'll send it to you later. But this guy, so he had a very long thread that I think was, and he's I'm going to just use the term social justice warrior to be a stand-in for sort of, I think, the political ideology that he believes in. And so he had this really long thread on Twitter about a group that he has called alt-libs, and that includes people like Sam Harris, Steven Pinker. Jesse Singal was on this thread, and he had like some really terrible, disparaging things to say about this, and essentially accused everybody that he's calling alt-lib as being sexual predators, which seems like really
a bit of a leap.
Yeah, it really sort of derailed the thread. But I think he was getting to something that I saw in another article yesterday, and from like a paper called, I can't remember, Spectator or something out of the UK, not one that I was familiar with, and I think one that might have some conservative leanings. But it was about what the author was calling the intellectual dark web, and I think that and alt-lib, for lack of a better terms, can be used to describe something that I think is happening right now, which is people who feel alienated from leftist social politics but have progressive values sort of coming together and finding each other. So while alt-lib was used in this derogatory way, I do think that something is happening now in response to these sort of knee-jerk, you're bad things that are happening on social media and in real life, which is people who are against that sort of rhetoric and who believe in empiricism and reject dogma, and reject tribalism. So essentially a tribe for people who reject tribalism. And I think that that's sort of emerging right now. And we'll probably look back at this time in history and say, like, this was the time that this thing happened. So I think that's real, but it's also sort of like even hard to talk about this. Like, I would say that you would be a part of this group, and I would be a part of this group.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying, I really hope that that's true. Whether or not I specifically agree with with the views of everybody. I mean, I think that's what's been. Yeah, I feel like I need to keep track when I think about this, that the bigger concern is to have an outlet for people of that, whatever sort of political persuasion that I think I fall under as well, to have an outlet for people who, like that, when I'm thinking about your follow-up piece to the trash one, where you describe what your views are to the conservatives who are happy to have you on board. Right. I was thinking like, okay, yes, like I get this. I really get this, because that's it. I mean, there needs to be some sort of possibility that isn't going full Trump. As it
totally
were. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, like there's when you get called out by your own people. So like, for example, after I wrote the detransition piece, so I was contacted by various groups of or various individuals who would call themselves gender critical. Trans activists would probably call them TERFs. So for the audience, that's trans exclusionary radical feminist. So that would be maybe people who object to some things that are happening in gender politics, like allowing trans people to use the bathroom of their gender identity. And so there's this sort of weird, like, it's like arch conservatives, like Jesus people, and then also radical feminists who don't disagree about anything, but they sort of, there's this Venn diagram where on this one issue they agree. And so after I wrote this piece, people in both camps started reaching out to me because they thought that I would be, simpatico with them. And while I'm not, they were the only people being nice to me. So it's really
Oh my goodness.
So
much
it's really
to say on
so it's like it's really, I can see how it'd be really easy to fall in with those groups because you're getting such hostility from the people who ideologically you actually agree with, that you naturally turn to people who want you to be there, who consider you an ally even if you're not. And there's a huge danger in that,
Absolutely. And I think that the danger comes in part from what you're talking about before, the siloing off, that if you're sort of not, if the only, if all you're exposed to is hate from people you agree with, then you don't really even know what the people you disagree with are actually saying in a way. And it's like they can just seem friendly. And that's, I think the danger is greater for like young people, like students and so forth, who maybe haven't quite formed their views about things. And I think, I think there has to be some sort of line, and it needs to be clear, like, that people are opposing sometimes the same things for very, very different reasons. So, like, if, I'm put off by a Twitter pylon, it's not the same thing as, like, if Trump talks about political correctness, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
And I think that I know that, but I'm 34 years old and, like, have a PhD and have, like, thought about stuff, overanalyzed stuff for, a long time. But I think if you're, like, 20 and you're just thinking about things, and this is where, I should know more about this being in Canada and all, but like with somebody like Jordan Peterson, I don't know if he falls on that. It seems like from some of his views, this is basically Trumpism, but a little bit sort of posher.
Right.
But I guess
Jordan Peterson. Yeah, I find him, I hate this word, but I find him legitimately problematic in the sense that I don't know what to think about him. I think some of what he says is right, and some of what he says is batshit crazy. But that's okay, because that's how people are, and it doesn't have to be. And that's the whole thing. Like, Jordan Peterson isn't necessarily trash because he believes these, but he refuses to use someone's pronoun. It doesn't mean that he might be a little bit of an asshole in that particular way. But
I think my concern there is that I think that what I really don't want to see happen is for this sort of third way, or however one wants to put it, to become a kind of cult of personality around somebody who is also like well to the right of where I think that way should be. But
I don't think that Jordan Peterson is a good. I think he would be a very convenient, because he has this massive platform now. And he does argue against I think some of this stuff does come from this over political correctness, and he argues against that. Like, I don't know, in the 80s and 90s, when the right wing was saying political correctness has gone overboard, at the time that just seemed to me, or at least in the 90s and the 80s, I wasn't young enough to really care about it, but it seemed to me just offensive and wrong. And then now sometimes I think, political correctness really has gone overboard. Like, do you listen to This American Life?
I think I know what you're gonna. I listened to that show. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So for the audience, This American Life recently did an episode called "Words You Can't Say," and when I saw the title, I sort of had a feeling about what it was going to be, and it starts out with this with Ira Glass talking to a young millennial producer on the show, and he's saying that he's a Jew, and she's saying, no, you're Jewish. Like, she just can't.
I had never heard of it either. I had never heard that either. I guess I'm of Ira Glass's generation. I don't know. I had never. Had you heard this, that you can't say a Jew?
Yes. I don't think anybody would say you can't say a Jew, but I've heard.
I've never even heard of that as being anything. The closest I've heard to this is like in my grandmother's generation. So my grandmother was Canadian, actually. I'm American, long story. But she would sort of like whisper Jewish, like to talk about, and she's, she was Jewish, and we all are. But it was, but that's something I thought had just gone away. And the thought that a Jew, I'd never heard of that until This American Life.
Yeah. Or the fact that a Jew, it's problematic when a Jew calls themselves a Jew. And to me, it's like, So I love that show for that reason. And I also loved it because the second half of the show. So the first half of the show, they're talking about Lacey Green, who's a leftist, and how she sort of got dogpiled for various reasons. But in the second half of the show, they look at basically the same thing that happens in a situation on the right. And the woman who was the target of the pylon on the right, I was struck by the fact that she used the same language that we use on the left. You know, she talked about how the right is eating its own. And to me, I felt like when I heard that, I just felt so connected to humanity for 1 minute, where I'm like, holy shit, we're all the same. We're all the same. The same things are happening. And we don't even see it on the right, especially. And it's a shame, especially, I think, for people in the media, that we are so disconnected from the right that not only do we not know those stories, it's mind-blowing when we actually hear those stories.
Yeah. I don't know. That's, as a Jew.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for that first, was it Lacey Green? Is that?
Yeah.
For that one, what I wondered about there, and I've wondered about this in some other kind of similar cases, is I think there's also the possibility that somebody who, when they're not even a certain age, for however long they identify one place politically, and maybe then they come to some sort of greater self-awareness about their politics, and they have different politics later. But then they have some sort of residual thing where they say, but I'm on the left, because they've always been saying that, or but I'm on the right. You know, I think it goes both ways. And I think because of this sort of team-like aspect of things, I think people who probably just don't have the politics they're claiming are like unable to really, I don't know, like, I think people should just be more able to say, you know what, I actually am not. I mean, I think about the bizarre political labels I gave myself in college, and I'm just glad that, I mean, I'm sure it is all online in one place or another, but it's not like readily findable. But
right.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely, I went to one meeting of the Libertarian Club. Learned I was not a libertarian.
Yeah.
All sorts of things.
I mean, I think that clearly people evolve as they age, and I definitely have, like, if I were 10 or 15 years younger, I would probably be one of the students protesting Jordan Peterson or whoever showing up to campus, because at that point in my life, being part of the dominant in crowd was far more important to me. Now I don't really give a shit. So I think my politics have evolved somewhat, but I also think now there's this thing that really drives me crazy, where when you disagree, especially on Twitter or wherever, with people politically, people on the left will just label you conservative. Yeah. And that, like, to me, I'm like, you can't, like, you don't get to decide it's like gender identity. You don't get to decide. It's a self-ID process. And if I say I'm on the left and that I'm in favor of high taxes on the rich, then I'm on the fucking left, damn it.
Well, your list of things in that follow-up piece, I mean, I don't think conservatives want to.
I mean, I've never voted for a conservative. I am genuinely, I'm a very progressive person. But because I've questioned some of the aspects of MeToo, because of what I've written about gender or whatever, people assume that I'm sort of the stranger's in-house conservative, which is crazy, because that's actually Dan Savage. Although that's a secret, he doesn't want anyone to know that.
So the Santorum thing is actually favorable.
Well, he's a fan of Santorum. That's what he doesn't tell you. Yeah. Yeah, it drives me crazy. I see this all the time. Like, people call Brett Weinstein, who's a professor at Evergreen, or a former professor at Evergreen State College in Washington and Olympia, who rose to prominence last year after he objected to some, like, equity initiatives at his school. And people say that Brett is on the right. Brett is conservative. His wife is conservative. People like Alice Traeger, whoever. You just change someone's designation, which, like, you can't do that, man. That's just kind of how I feel about it.
Well, I think that's maybe where there needs to be, like, I mean, I don't know how this would ever work practically, but just, like, all new labels for everything. Yeah, because
all new labels.
That's also a possibility. But
we could all be assigned a number. I think about that sometimes, like, when it comes to sexuality, like, there's so many the words in sexuality have become so meaningless because there's so many different terms for things. Like you're a pan-demisexual sapiosexual who's also an other. There's just so many labels. I think that it would be easier if we just assigned ourselves a number on the Kinsey scale. So you could be like, I'm a 6 or I'm a 1 or I'm a 3, and then just do away with all of the other bullshit labels. Although I'm sure I will get in trouble for calling the labels bullshit. I'm sorry, everybody. I respect your labels.
I don't know. I think, I mean, I just think whatever the politics are the politics of going onto Twitter, finding whatever might have been slightly problematic and be like, first, like that sort of impulse to comment on something and be first. I feel like that's different politics than this sort of like third way thing. But I also think that the sort of third way thing is different politics than the sort of like being progressive only in the sense of criticizing other progressives thing. Right. I think that's its own sort of like, I think there's just all these different strains and that like, yeah, I don't know. I sometimes feel like I just don't have a team in all of this. And I just, totally. I feel like I'm just going to like the stuff by the wrong people enough times and be blocked by the whole of Twitter. Yeah. And then I'll get a lot more done because it's like nothing.
That's true. Okay. And then the solar flares will take out the internet and we'll all be better off.
Yes.
That's often how it feels like for me, is not having a team. That said, I've also found a lot of people I agree with, actually that's not true. A small number of people I agree with, and having relationships with them, if it's just like direct messages via Twitter, has been really helpful to be like, okay, I'm not crazy. These things really are happening. Like,
and it's all it seems like this is for me as well, also happening in kind of direct messages and so forth, and not really,
And also, there's I think psychologists would probably have a lot to say about why people pile on, and I think there is something really fun about being a part of that, and I certainly am guilty of that for sure. I have tried in recent months to be less of an asshole on Twitter and not pile on people, even people on the right, because I realize that they're also humans. But there is something really fun, and I think that makes you feel, when everybody around you is engaged in this thing where, you've all decided who the villain is and you can all attack at the same time, it makes you feel like you're a part of something.
And I think it also makes you feel immune to having this happen to yourself. Like that's something that I think is entering into it, especially when it's people who are outraged on behalf of, rather than who are outraged personally about something. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think the crowd will come for everybody in the end. It really does not take much of a misstep for you to find yourself on the wrong side of an online mob at this point, which actually gives me sort of hope, because I think that means the coalition of people opposed to online mobs will grow as more and more people become the focus of them.
Well, that's something to be hopeful about. Yes. I don't know when we started. Oh, I think we're probably, it's been like almost an hour.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about MeToo much, but...
Oh, do you have anything, what's your take on MeToo?
I don't know that I have a quick take on MeToo. I think that some things are good about it and some things are bad about it. I think that, one thing I do think is that we should be tolerant or just aware of the fact that until very recently, behavior that was deemed acceptable has no longer become acceptable. And I think we just need to be aware of that, like the Shaun White thing. Do you know about this?
No.
So Shaun White, the snowboarder, after he won his gold medal in the Olympics, it turns out that he was in a band, or he had a band. He was like the rich head man of this band, and he was paying people to be in his band. And he had over the course of being in this band, he had sent one of his bandmates, or his employees, I suppose, some like it was portrayed in the media as like dick pics essentially. But I saw the text that he sent, and it wasn't actually. That makes me think like he sent pics of his genitals, which is like totally fucked up and wrong, and an unsolicited dick pic is a terrible thing. What he actually sent was like kind of funny meme gifs of dicks, which like it's still inappropriate, but like the dude was like a 25-year-old snowboarder, so inappropriate, but also like entirely appropriate for that sort of subculture of you know. And to me, so it's like he's being judged on this thing that when he did it, it was normal. And there's some danger in that too, because like you could expand that to like, okay, Roy Moore, when Roy Moore was hitting on 12-year-old, 14-year-old girls in the 1970s, was that normal? So I think there's a danger in being too relative when it comes to judging.
But there's at the same time, like, it hasn't been this exact month forever, and there needs to be some kind of
I just think some tolerance, and like for people who are, I don't know, I find myself in a strange position because for probably most of my adulthood, I would have considered myself a lesbian separatist, and now I'm like the one person in my office defending men, which is an odd rebranding for me. But I think that, like, I don't know, I think a modicum of tolerance is in order, and also differentiate. Like, I read an article recently in that Lauren Duca wrote. Is that how you pronounce it, Lauren Duca?
I think so.
So she interviewed like 5 millennial feminists, including, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Her first name is Emma, the woman at the Columbia student who was sexually assaulted and for like a year or two even carried a mattress around on her back as a performance art piece. And so she was talking to these 5 millennial women, I think it was 5, about MeToo, and Emma in this piece, they started talking about Chuck Close, who's an artist who was recently, there were allegations of harassment against him in Seattle. A university took a self-portrait of his off of their walls, Seattle University. And Emma said in this piece, Chuck Close, he's a Harvey Weinstein. And I looked up the specific allegations against him, and what he was alleged with is making vulgar comments. And so to me, to like even if he's not being prosecuted, that's incredible damage to his reputation, what has happened. And maybe he's an asshole, maybe he's a prick, but that doesn't mean that he's a rapist. And
the blurring is frustrating. I guess so my take on Me Too is, I guess, a bit different, because I guess I don't think anybody has ever thought me to be a lesbian separatist. I'm more wired the other way. And that's what I think Me Too, like what I come up against is this notion that it's sort of tragic that some women are straight and are interested in men, and what a curse it is. And I think this has been, a source of a lot of joy and pleasure in my life, from having crushes on boys as a kid, to as an adult, actual relationships with men. And and it just seems like this notion that it's all bad.
Right. All men are bad. Even if it's not all men. Right. But men are bad.
And just that it's sort of somewhat tragic that some women would go that way. And it's just like, no, it's not tragic. It's most women are at least somewhat interested in men, and this is not tragic. And at the same time, I also feel like I fall in this general supporter of Me Too camp, simply because I think of a lot of bad things that happened in my own youth that would have gone a lot better had there been sort of awareness of them at the time. So I think it's tricky. I think I'd like there to be more. And this came up on a recent Savage Love cast, but I don't remember in what context. But there was a guest on who was a woman, I think, talking about, what was she talking about? Could have been sex toys, could have been anything. But just saying that there needs more about like joy and that aspect of things. And I think in general, for just women in general, not just women with any particular sexual orientation, there should be like some, it's not all dire. Not everything is
sure. For sure.
Remember.
Yeah. And I think it's really, I get the impulse to sort of say, men are trash. Men are perpetuators of the patriarchy, and the patriarchy is trash, and therefore men are trash. I get that impulse. And probably not that long ago, I would have said the same thing. But I also think that's hugely damaging to men. And even if you don't like men, even if you think that men are trash, there's a reason to not do that, because when you create this hostility, that's how I think you have the rise of the men's rights activists and that demographic of people who are threatened by women, who hate women because they can't have them, or because they think that women look down on them. And when you say that, that's the message that boys and men are getting, is that they're inherently bad. The same way that it's bad for women to get the message that they're inherently weak, which they aren't. So I agree. I would say that I'm, broadly speaking, I'm a supporter of MeToo, but like everything else, I don't think that means that it's above criticism.
Yeah. Well, I think we are, both of us, capable of laying on that criticism.
Yeah.
So it's been nice connecting on trash to trash.
Yeah, you as well.
Great to virtually meet you. So again, this has been, I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and
I'm Katie Herzog.
And goodbye, blogging heads.
Bye.